Hey all, welcome to Now We're Talking with Doug Pagitt. Today it was Mark Galli talking with me, Doug Pagitt. You know, I promised all of you more flow from the podcast, more choices, more options, more podcasts, and you got it. And some of you have responded over on my Patreon site to become contributors, patrons, funders of this kind of effort. I'd love to invite all of you to join me over there. You can go to dougpagitt.com and you'll see the link for it there. Well, here's my conversation with Mark Galli. I've known Mark for a number of years. I like him a lot. Mark is the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, and Mark's latest book is on a theologian named Karl Barth. Now, if you don't know who Karl Barth is, don't worry. It's an interesting conversation, even if you don't know. And if you do know who Karl Barth is, it's a really interesting conversation because you know who Karl Barth is. So please stick it through. I think you're going to love it. It's a whole lot of fun, and we get into some contemporary issues as much as issues of theologians in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s in Germany. Those two things come together. Not a lot of podcasts give you that promise. Theologians from the 20s through the 60s in Germany with contemporary issues of today. The problem is that contemporary issues of today are some kind of difficult and sad ones for a lot of people, but the podcast is, I think, a good treatment of that. So here it is. You can pick up Mark's book called Karl Barth, An Introduction for Evangelicals. Hey, thanks everybody for being a part of this with me. Well, hey everybody, I'm talking with Mark Galli. Mark is the author of the new book, Karl Barth, An Introduction for Evangelicals. That is the subtitle, right? You've targeted the audience right in your subtitle.
That is correct. Yep.
So, Mark, you do a number of things in the world, and I'm proud to have been your friend for a long time. So, congratulations on the book. You also work at Christianity Today.
Yes.
And
I'm editor-in-chief.
Editor-in-chief.
Yes.
It's a big deal.
So, yeah. So if you like what's going on, I'll take the credit. If you don't like it, it's because of everyone else who works for the organization, of course.
Yeah. Well, and you've been doing that for a long time. Your life at Christianity Today has been a long run.
Yes. So with the company, it's been 28 years. I started with the Leadership Journal, went to Christian History Magazine, and since about 2000, I've been with the flagship.
So you've been spending a lot of time thinking about evangelicals and Christianity in North America and theology and culture and all the things you have to do when you're at a theology journal or another journal. So for people who don't know a lot about Karl Barth, because I know this is hard for the Barth people in the world, but
to imagine that?
It's my guess that of 7 billion people alive, most people have not actually heard of Karl Barth
exactly.
or know why Karl Barth would be important. So why would someone with all of your varied interests and great capacities in the world, why did you decide to put together an introduction on a German theologian from the mid-20th century?
Yeah. Well, first of all, he has been increasingly let me back up and say more and more evangelical scholars have been interested in Barth in this generation. Yeah. Although a number of were influenced in the previous generation, people like Jeffrey Bromley, who translated Barth's dogmatics, among others. And CT has been commentating on Barth's work since the 1950s, really. The other reason is that Barth is, in fact, arguably the most important Protestant theologian in the 20th century. And as readers of CT, we like to be aware of who's important, even if we happen to disagree with them. We want to know who they were, what they taught, what we can buy into, what we cannot. A third reason was that I do think Barth offers some resources for evangelicals that could be very helpful for us. So Barth, for example, is Christocentric. That is to say, his whole theology twirls around the hub of Jesus Christ, his life, death, and resurrection. And there is nothing he talks about that he doesn't begin by talking about Jesus Christ at some level. And for evangelicals, the way I describe them in the words of Anne Lamott, evangelicals are very Jesus-y people.
Yeah, right.
So while our understanding of Jesus is not as deeply theological, it is profoundly personal and experiential. Mm-hmm. And Barth might give us some theological tools to help take that experiential conversation to a deeper level that can resonate with various and sundry ways that evangelicals think and talk about Jesus. So those would be some of the reasons.
Yeah, well, those are good reasons. And Karl Barth was, in the 1960s, a famous person. If you can imagine that theologians would get on the cover of Time magazine, right?
Exactly, right, yeah.
He had sway in the culture. A lot of people were paying attention to Barth's ideas. But I got to tell you, I find that hard to believe because I've had to dip into Karl Barth's writings. It's really hard to get and really hard to understand. And sometimes when I'm around the Barth people, I think, you folks must speak a different language than I do. Can you say a few things about that? Why you think he had such power in the 1950s and 1960s, and just how difficult the material can be for people that aren't theologically inclined or professionals?
One of the reasons he was popular in America in the 50s and 60s is because his work was finally getting translated in large chunks. But he actually made his biggest impact on the theological world in the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah.
When all his stuff was in German. So the reigning theological paradigm in the end of the 19th, early 20th century in theological circles, certainly in Europe, but also in America, was what we now summarize by the phrase 19th century liberalism.
Yeah.
And it was the
good old days.
The fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man.
Yeah.
It found it very difficult to take the miraculous seriously. The resurrection was considered a metaphor. Jesus' death on the cross was just essentially a gross thing to think about. Mm-hmm. It took all the blood out of classic orthodoxy and tried to reinterpret it to an Enlightenment mind, soften its edges, make it more moralistic. And Barth came along and said, baloney. We have to take the Bible more seriously. He would never say take it literally, but we certainly have to take it with utmost seriousness as to what it proclaims about Jesus Christ. And he basically put orthodoxy back on the map of the theological world. And from that point on, instead of simply theologians dismissing classic orthodoxy, they had to actually deal with it through Barth. And his essential reaffirmation of the Nicene Creed, the definition of call to son, and other classic Orthodox statements. But that information doesn't really get to America till the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah. So it was not only just in Germany. It was not only just in Germany, but it was in academia, or it was in the theological circles, and not really hitting the people's thoughts quite yet.
Really, even the reigning debate in the 50s would have been between Bultmann and Barth. Bultmann's project was to demythologize the New Testament. His famous statement is, you can't, a modern person who believes in the light bulb can't believe in the miracles of the Bible, which now we recognize as being an absolutely absurd statement.
Yeah, right.
Grounded in a vision of modernity, which we all recognize as quite prejudicial. But at the time, it was very influential. So Barth and Bultmann were two sides of an argument. And so during the 50s, that was a heated argument. Really, by the 60s, Barth's influence is already starting to wane. We have the Death of God movement. We have the rise of liberation theology, and other things are beginning to capture people's attention. So in a sense, writing about Barth now, or evangelical interest in Barth, is it's the resurrection of an author and some themes. This happens in the world of theology. Most theological problems are never actually solved.
That's a good point to remind people of, because a lot of people act as if they are.
And what happens
exactly
is we just get tired of talking about them after a while.
Yeah.
And then about 50 years after they're passé, someone comes along and says, actually, the issues that person raised were really important, and I'd like to give it a fresh start. So I think that's what's been happening in some circles of theology in the last 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, and there's been a bunch of church practitioners, populist theologians that have found themselves paying attention to Karl Barth and kind of finding themselves in a little Barth group, right? What I've noticed is that somehow Barthian thinking has become a tribe that people can find themselves as a part of, right?
Yeah.
And that once you're in that group, your admission to the group is saying, I'm Barthian on that topic, and then you get welcomed in by a bunch of people. And frankly, if you say that you don't think Karl Barth's suggestions about the way to view the world or the Bible or Jesus is not your thing, you can be moved out of that little tribe pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, it can be kind of cultish. I mean, when you get into anyone's theology or philosophy that is, in a sense, all encompassing, it can be captivating, and it can be like a drug. I mean, the way Barth approaches things is just so interesting. It's so amazing. I mean, I go through streaks back and forth where, along with morning prayer and reading, I read through the lectionary in the morning. I'll finish my morning prayer by reading 3 or 4 pages of the dogmatics because it is so riveting to me. It is so inspiring. So I can see the attraction. But of course, Barth himself was the first person to say he wasn't a Barthian. And he didn't know who these Barthians were because he wasn't trying to start a school.
Right. So he wasn't trying to say, I'm saying something. He was trying to say, this is what the text or what the
either that or he was
teaches.
saying this is his goal was to help people think theologically, which also meant help them to think biblically. Yeah. So that's one of the main reasons I read him. I mean, there are some of his conclusions I find riveting, and I say amen. There's others of his conclusions I go, I don't buy it, Karl.
Yeah.
But in the process of saying I don't buy it, Karl, he forces me to actually not just think theologically, but to rethink biblically. Why do we hold this idea, or where does this come from, or what passages really speak to it? He really forces me to think theologically in a way that I think is more true to classic Christianity. That is to say, biblically. That is to say, we start, certainly from a Protestant perspective, what does the Bible teach about this, and how do we understand that? As opposed to more philosophical theology, which might start by saying, well, here's a problem, but what does Heidegger think about this? What does Kierkegaard think about this? And that's a different way of doing theology.
Yeah, it is a different project.
It has its own strengths and weaknesses. I think from a churchman's point of view, I'm a former pastor. I really believe in the divine creation of the Church of Jesus Christ. I do think the way Barth does theology is probably more healthy and helpful for the local church and for the pastor than
okay, so let me ask you about that.
Philosophical approach,
because you felt a need in 2017 to publish a book, Karl Barth, an introduction for evangelicals. And I'm wondering if part of that was because so many people can't access Barth sort of on their own. So while his ideas and his approach, especially the Barthian approach, starting with the narrative of the Bible and letting that inform how we want to understand our theology is important, a lot of people can't access it very easily, can they? No,
not at all.
So what good is it to your average sort of pastor that, I mean, maybe you whip open a page or two of the dogmatics, of his big tomes.
Then you get lost.
Then you get lost. Then you get lost. Then you say, boy, I hope people at my church don't think I sound like that when I'm rattling on about it. Okay, so why?
But I should interrupt you here and say, when German pastors read the dogmatics in German when it first came out, they loved it. They felt like it really gave some ground and foundation to their preaching that they had desperately needed. So some of that's an American problem.
Oh, that's interesting.
That we're not trained to think theologically. Most of our pastors are not trained to think theologically to the depth and the nuance that European theologians are.
And some of it, frankly, is just sentence structure and the way an argument is made. Like, it's not that
as an editor, let me tell you that Barth needed an editor. I mean, he has sentences that go on for 50, 80, 100, 150 words. It's just crazy.
Yeah, it's madness, and it's something that makes people believe, if you dabble in the field of theology at all, that what it means to be theological is to think the way the people who wrote those sentences want to convey their ideas. And that's not particularly theological. It's particularly, 1920s Germany.
Exactly.
And that didn't necessarily lead to the greatest view of the world, one might want to be reminded of.
But you asked the question about the why it's difficult to So one of the purposes of the book was to do two things. Now, one is to meet a common human need among people who are readers and fancy themselves at least as amateur intellectuals, and that is they know that Karl Barth is someone they should be familiar with.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if you're a well-read person, a well-read Christian who takes theology seriously,
that's a good point.
You need to at least be aware of who Karl Barth was, along with a number of other people. And this book is going to help you get familiar with him enough so that when you're at a party or church fellowship and someone talks about Barth, you can actually enter into the conversation somewhat intelligently.
Right. And when someone says,
I think we all read books. I certainly read books or even articles to help me become familiar with a thinker or an idea, so that I'm not completely flummoxed when that conversation piece comes up, because I pride myself in being a person who's conversant, at least in intellectual trends, theological trends. I don't pretend to be an expert in any of these, but it's nice to be able to be facile and at some level.
Yeah.
So that's frankly one of the purposes of the book. And the other purpose is for those who then take that step. There's a bibliography at the end that says, okay, here's the most important things that Barth wrote. Here I'm putting an asterisk by the ones where you might want to begin. So his book, Dogmatics and Outline, which is an exposition of the Apostles' Creed, is a really good place to begin. His book on evangelical theology is a really good place to begin. Dogmatics is not a good place to begin. So,
well, and a primer for a lot of people is just simply that Barth is spelled with a TH at the end and not to be pronounced Barth. And when someone says, I'm into Barth, they don't think The Simpsons, right? I tell you, Mark, that's the level that a lot of people are starting this conversation.
I don't think I actually did that in the book, but I do run across a number of people who pronounce it as Barth. And I do too. I should help people with that, because it's, once you find out it's Barth, it's just a little embarrassing. It's not that big of a deal, but it's one of those subtle things that say or you don't know. Talking about.
Yes, yes, yeah. You read it on the internet somewhere, or you've talked to somebody about it. That's the difference. Okay, so you were working on this book. I'd imagine for a guy like you, it takes you 3 or 6 months to put a book like this together, or a little longer. So you're working on this book for a long time. You're ready for this to come out in the evangelical world, and then in 2016. A scholar of Barth releases information in the academic theological world that became more familiar to people in 2017 in a journal article, saying that, hey, the things that people have known about Karl Barth in the theological world, we now have more information about his relationship, not just with his wife, but with another woman. And that has stirred up a whole lot of controversy. And the trying to understand that relationship, and the best I can get it, the children of Barth and grandchildren wanted to release some of his personal letters that he was sending to both of these women that he was in long-term relationships with. And that created a real controversy. And so it brings our conversation about your book that has just recently come out, and now you're trying to have a conversation about Karl Barth. And I feel like it's crossing with this other cultural flow of the Me Too movement that so many women, so importantly, are raising. And across our society, people recognizing that men in positions of power have been in relationships or used their sexuality in ways that have abused women that didn't feel equal. And it makes me wonder how two things, how you feel about that and how people should think about Karl Barth in light of the fact that, this feels like a Kevin Spacey kind of scandal, right? Where people might feel a little unnerved about bringing up these issues around Karl Barth, or the theology of Karl Barth, if people know, wasn't he the guy that had that, was it an affair, or was he in a polyamorous relationship with that woman that lived in his house? Right. So that's that. The release of your book comes out right at the time of the release of this information.
I planned all that,
and here we go.
No, it didn't plan it at all.
What's your next book on? John Yoder?
Exactly. Which is even. Yeah, it's more troublesome. Well, who knows how you rate these things?
How you rate trouble? Trouble is just trouble.
It's trouble with a capital T. Yeah. No, I was aware of it. It's his long-standing relationship with Charlotte Vaughn, his lifelong assistant, starting in the late 1920s. Yes, and I do talk about this in my book. I talk about it in more general terms because these letters hadn't been published yet, so I was not aware of some of the detailed justifications Barth used to justify the relationship. But for the listeners, watchers' point of view, you should realize that he entered into this relationship with this assistant. They fell madly in love with one another, to the point where Bart contemplated getting a divorce from his wife. That issue went back and forth, and eventually they decided against the divorce and did agree to have her move into the family home.
So instead of getting divorced over this relationship, Karl and his wife decide to have
my assumption is
woman
that
move into her house.
She had her own room. They didn't share a room in the home, but he did take her on his business trips. That is to say, when he would lecture, and they would rent the same 1-bedroom train car or hotel. Again, we have no actual knowledge of what went on behind the bars, but it was clear that he was deeply in love with this woman, and these letters admit that and confess that, and he feels a responsibility both to maintain that relationship because he feels it's genuine. We'll talk about that in a second. But also he knows he's the husband of this woman, Nellie Barth, who's the mother of his children, for whom he is grateful for what she has done, and does for him and for his family. So he tries to maintain both those relationships going forward. I don't think it's quite fair to characterize it as Bart being in a position of power. The sense from everything I've read is he really did consider Charlotte it wasn't like a one-night stand. He took advantage of his power. It was like they had a long-term relationship that and she was a collaborator with him on his theology. In fact, there is an increasing number of monographs written about how much did Charlotte contribute to various and sundry volumes. Most people think of her as a great thinker in her own right. And he even acknowledges in various places that she was very helpful to him in sorting out his thoughts and that sort of thing. So the power dynamics don't quite work. It's simply a matter of Bart. So that's one set of issues. Now, another set of issues is that I bring up in the book based on, again, my book is, I am not a true scholar in the regard. I don't know German. I didn't read originals in the German, but I read what people who are scholars said about Bart, and I summarized that for a popular audience. So the people I read were talking about the fact that Bart, when he was younger, he was actually in love with a woman whom his father forbade him to marry for social class reasons, from what I understand.
He's got 3 women in his love heart.
So,
or maybe he's got more.
She dies. He eventually marries Nellie, who was was in one of his catechism classes when he was a pastor.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me. He married.
But from what I understand, it was sort of an arranged marriage.
Wow. So he was a pastor at a church, and she was a teenager in the church.
Yeah, right.
And when she reached old enough age, he married her.
Yeah,
I got to tell you, this is where people, and I think they're right, start raising issues around power that are a little different than just forcing it on someone.
See that,
but when older men are using their positions of leadership and getting into relationships, that makes some people, and I can understand why.
I understand. No, I get the argument, but I think to read every human relationship, certainly every relationship between men and women, as essentially a relationship in which that is being negotiated by power, and see that through that lens alone. I think that's so reductionistic of what a complex thing is going on in between two human beings.
But is it possible for it not to be that lens alone, but to have that be one of the filters by which we do?
There's no question. It is one of the filters, but it's just one. There are so many other things going on,
but if you've ever been in a position,
what that power looks like and how he expresses it, and what the power the man has and what power the woman has, my gosh, that's just
this is why it's hard to talk about and why it gets hidden in so many situations, right? And so often the default, though, let me just finish this thought. So often the default goes to, well, this is really difficult to talk about, so let's not talk about it, and then men get to keep doing whatever it is that they're doing, right? That's the holdup with that. Hey, this is really hard and super complicated when people feel like they're on that side. So I think that's where it crosses with the current situation. And anyone who's been in a relationship with a professor, or
you're supposed to be challenging me, I know, but let me challenge
you. Yeah, please, no, please.
The assumption of that comment, Doug, is that we're not. That side of the argument is not allowed even to be erased because it's immediately dismissive. Of course, you're saying that because you're in a position of power and you don't want to take it seriously.
Yeah, right.
So even the comment itself precludes any real actual conversation other than about power.
Okay, but could I say, I think that's right. I do think that's true. Part of the reason that people use that argument, though, is that the vast history of the experience has been that men have had power, have used it in ways that have made life difficult for women, even when they've been in relationships with them, that the power dynamics have not been equal. So it is true that it can be a shutdown question to ask, or a comment to raise, or a perspective to invoke. But there might be good reason for that in light of the fact.
No, I don't deny that.
The
conversation wouldn't have arisen hadn't there been some problem we're trying to address. That's right. For sure.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, agree.
Yep.
We can agree on that. That's for sure. And as a male, I can certainly confess that I have used my physical strength or intellectual gifts to intimidate when I shouldn't have. Yeah. I think every man will confess to that at some level. Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Because we're just broken human beings. Mm-hmm. That's all. That's all there is to it. Anyway, back to Karl. It appears that he wasn't emotionally completely happy in his marriage to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so he discovers this woman with whom he has both intellectual and emotional connection that is so powerful. He does something. This is what's interesting to me. It does something to him that it completely doesn't negate. It completely contradicts his theological project.
Really? Like he's just so flummoxed by the love for this woman that he
yeah. So one of the reasons Barth rejects 19th century liberalism is because it's so subjective.
Yeah.
It's Schleiermacher defined religion as the feeling of dependence. It's a feeling religion.
Yeah.
And Barth is trying to say, that's not a feeling. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ that comes from outside us and comes to us.
Yeah.
And feelings, and you'll highly find anything in Barth's Dogmatics in which he talks about his experience.
Yeah.
None that I've found yet.
Right. He seems very cold in his theological approach.
And
but not at
keeps
home.
On coming back to the text. He keeps on coming back to the revelation of God coming to him from the outside. Wow. He talks about that in very dramatic language. He's very upset with his theological professors at the beginning of World War I, when they basically say they get swept up in the feeling of patriotism, and they equate that with the will of God to go to war.
Nice.
He gets really upset in the 1930s with his colleagues who get swept up with Hitler mania and just feel like, this feels great. It must be the will of God for a people. And here he goes, and he basically says, and one of the things we discover in these letters, he basically says, well, this can't be of the devil because it feels so good and right.
Yeah, in this other relationship. And boy, I'll tell you, had a little more of that Karl Barth, this experiential side that was driving his understanding of the truth of his life. I think it would have helped his. Message a little bit if he wasn't so. If he hadn't been so cold. This might actually endear people to the guy a little bit.
Well, that could be.
That he has two struggles going on. Hey, so how do you think? So a lot of people I know that are pastors that are into Karl Barth also are into the kinds of churches that carry a policy by which someone who does what Karl Barth did would not be allowed to be on the church council or be a pastor at the church or something. And you probably, if that was your friend that you used to quote because he had great insights on God, you find that out about your friend, you're going to set all that aside and no longer quote your friend. Where do you think, as Barth being a theologian, that people will or should start doing likewise if it is in alignment with how they behave in their churches? So I pastor a church where we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't blacklist Karl Barth because his love relationship had expanded beyond. So we wouldn't say he's someone you just don't talk to. But a lot of churches, they're organized to do that very thing.
Right.
Do you think they now I'm kind of asking you not as the Karl Barth scholar of scholars, but the Christianity Today commentator, let's say.
Yeah.
What do you think about that and the necessity for that to be something that those same churches that have barred people, kicked them out and everything else and are quoting Karl Barth as their theological root or their theological source a lot of times, how do you think they should reconcile that?
Well, we all, of course, as a pastor and preacher, you always have to take the temperature of who you're speaking to.
Yeah.
And there would be occasions now where I just wouldn't quote The fact is, one of the reasons Barth was held in suspicion for so many decades is because people have known about this relationship. The only thing this article from 2016, 2017 reveals is some more details, and especially Barth's justification for it. If I may say, paltry justification for it, which was kind of a shock to me. But at any rate, so there are some audiences I just wouldn't quote Barth before this incident or after, because it would be like either I don't know who he is, or I understand he was an adulterer. Why should I listen to him? And that would be the type of audience. What's the point of even bringing his name up? Because you don't quote someone you quote someone to bring more gravity and persuasiveness to your talk.
Yeah.
So why bring them up? You're just going to make your point harder for them to grab. So there is that very practical element.
Don't you feel like maybe there's just an opportunity here for some of those same people who've held Barth in such high regard to expand their gracefulness a bit and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't exclude the people and the ideas of people, even though their lives don't comport to all of our standards. Isn't he a great example for the time where you've held so deeply to someone, his books are on your bookshelf, and you learn something about him, doesn't comport? Isn't this the ideal time for those people to maybe be a little more uncomfortable? Because, I mean, you're somebody who I know has done really well at helping people.
It's not even a matter of them being more uncomfortable. It's just that you can't take away the greatness of his project. I mean, it was 8,000 pages of very thoughtful theology on all manner of topic to great depth and I think great insight. So to simply dismiss someone because of a sin or a series of sins or misdeeds
or a lifetime of relationship
or a lifetime, it's decades he did this.
Yeah.
Okay. Would be if we start looking into the lives of any of the great thinkers in the church or even outside the church, or the great deeds of heroic men and women, and realize we won't have a whole lot to say about anything anymore. The fact of the matter is, God is in the habit of using really broken people to do some rather astounding things. He used Cyrus, who was, by all other standards that we use, an oppressor of many peoples in his ancient world. But he used Cyrus to help Israel go back, the people of Israel go back to their land. It's the same controversy we're having in the United States in general. We find out that Thomas Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings. We find out that George Washington had slaves. And all of a sudden there's this knee-jerk instinct to say, wipe them off the face of American history. And it's like, that's a sad way of doing history. It is. It's and really, it's self-righteous, and it doesn't treat human beings with any sense of grace or mercy. Yeah.
But it feels like what we ought to do is raise up those that we have pushed down too low because of their not fitting our standards, right? It should bring down the heroes, not to the pits, but back down to the rest of us. And it feels to me, and this is part of my project in the world, is for Christian spirituality to be the great leveler, to be that which puts us all on the same place, not to let someone fall too low and be dismissed, and not to let someone be risen up too high that they can't be challenged or that they need to be raised up in a mythical sense. So, and that's one of the things that I think some of the pushback is on, is not just, hey, are we going to throw stones at everyone? But some people feel like the Christian church has done a whole lot to kick them out because of their life or their beliefs or their way of living and who they've loved. And then this guy all of a sudden is like, hey, well, on this one, we're gonna go a little gentle and get a pass. That's where I think that hypocrisy feels so deep to people, especially in the Christian church. I think in the United States history conversation, there's some other dynamics at play there.
Right.
But I think your book comes at a really great time for evangelicals who want to take Barth seriously, because we are in the midst. I mean, I'll tell you, it used to be that back in the early 2000s, 1990s, when we met, the issue of gay and lesbian inclusion in churches was a really big conversation. And it was a big national conversation. I feel I'm in conversations quite often and think that the issue around polyamory or multiple relationships feels very much like it's on the same cusp that same-sex relationships
are. That's very interesting.
It is unbelievably common and pastors I talk to, this is what they're talking about more often than they ever thought they were. They have no idea how to talk about it, where to turn, or to even bring it up with anyone. I try to talk about it publicly because I have a number of friends who are in relationships like this, and they want it to stop being so taboo, and other pastors that are like, man, if somebody would start talking about this, because if I even bring it up, people in my church freak out. Like they want to know immediately who it is. And so it's curious that at this very moment, this issue around Bart in this love affair with both his wife, that sounds like from his letters he loved, and this other woman, and somehow he's holding those over decades in her. Boy, that is just shockingly a very contemporary issue. And if you guys at CT haven't done articles on this yet, I would really encourage you to do that. In fact, CNN's just releasing yet another CNN special about people in these relationships.
Okay.
It is the topic for the next 10 or 15 years. That's fresh, that's new, and I think a lot of us are having to deal with. So I think you accidentally stumbled into the theological crosshairs.
Accidentally relevant, which is like horrifying to me.
Christianity Today, accidentally relevant again.
Exactly.
That's the tagline.
We like to stand for eternal truth, and I'm personally passionate about history, which is never relevant.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Hey, Mark, if people want to pick up the book, obviously they can get it at all the places where you normally get books.
Exactly.
Barnes & Noble, online, Amazon, all those places. Is there any place that's particularly good for you if people buy the book?
Not particularly, no.
Okay.
I guess they could order from me personally.
They can go to markgalli.com.
All right. Figure it to package it and send it. I'd have to charge them double for the book.
All right. And if that's right, for the shipping and what it cost you. And if people are not going to find themselves in Carroll Springs, Illinois, Carroll Stream, Illinois, to stop into the CT offices, where else can they find you? Are you on the internet? Are you traveling around at all for the book tour?
I do try to comment on Twitter every once in a while, but very seldom. I do publish something called the Galli Report, which people can find at Christianity Today /the Galli Report. That GALLI. And it's a weekly newsletter I send out with links and commentary on those links. So if they would like to subscribe to that. And of course, I write regularly for Christianity Today, so that would be another place for them to
your byline is there.
Hear what goes on in my crazy mind.
Well, great. Well, hey, congratulations on the book, and thanks for all the good work.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You bet. So the book is Karl Barth, An Introduction for Evangelicals. Again, I should make that clear so people who are wanting to look it up can look it up. All right. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. Well, there it was. Hope you enjoyed. And if you enjoy these podcasts and all the other ones, I'd love you to tell people about it. Share it around Facebook. Spread it in the places where you tell people about podcasts. Let people know. And if you want to see more of these, head over to the Patreon site. You can get there at dougpagitt.com. By the way, Pagitt, 1G, 2 T's. Some people tell me they can't find it. And then I see the spelling. Anyway, love having you around. Appreciate your participation in the podcast. Thanks a lot.